Hi there, my little Devochkas and Chalaviks. Welly. Welcome to the Deadly Analysis podcast. Me and my droogs, Shara and Ben, videoed a bit of film called A Clockwork Orange that's like real horror show. Directed by the master himself, one Stanley K. This cine is all about the Disney activities of youth, like the old in-out, tog-chucking and ultra-violence, and, of course, the state's responsibility within a free society. You didn't think I was going to do the entire podcast in a Clockwork Orange slang, did you? If you're new to this podcast, we take good horror films and we dissect it. We talk about its themes, the filmmaking, its philosophy, and this film is rich in all of the subjects we can discuss. We'll talk about sexuality, free will, the state's responsibility in a free society, and try to get at all the elements that make this film, in my opinion, one of the most important films of the 20th century. So we'll start with some general thoughts. Shara, Ben, my droogs, what did you think of A Clockwork Orange?
Well, I chose the film, and I thought it would be really fun to get into some deep discussions about the government and about prison and about youth and about, well, there's a lot of other really horrible conversations that might come up, such as rape and how we treat homeless people and so many other things. But this really is one of the most horrific movies to me, especially when we have the eye-opening scene that is truly one of those terrifying images that sticks with you for life. Just someone prying someone's eyes open to force them to watch violence and horrible imagery while putting something in them to make them sick. So that definitely was something that stuck with me for life. It always made me a little bit uncomfortable. But I love this film. You're going to hear me talk about how great I think this film is for the whole entire show, trust me. But I would like to hear what Ben's view of it is as well. I know that this is one of those movies that people either love or hate, so...
Well, not to be contrary to that framework, I suppose, I do think so I want to contextualize this by saying I did read the book, and it's been a little while, I'll admit. But comparing the two, and I'm not sure how much of a comparison we really want to do, because it's probably a good idea to try and take this work as just itself, right? And just kind of analyze it on its own merits. But I do want to at least say that I feel like I enjoyed the book a little bit more because the entire message seems to be different because of key things that were either left in or taken out of the film. I think a lot of that revolves around the societal responsibilities that you alluded to earlier. And because of that, I do think that the film is still pretty good because it's interesting, and obviously Kubrick is a fantastic director, but it leaves a little bit to be desired. So I find myself middling on it. Perhaps throughout the course of this discussion, I'll be swayed one way or the other.
That's interesting that you, I read the book too. I think we've got 3 readers on the podcast tonight, which, I'm of the opinion, as always, that, the books don't matter, that we kind of view films as a different medium. And so there's a different aesthetic criteria and a different set of judgments. And so our responses to the film are almost independent of our responses to the book. That's always been my philosophy. I think that when we talk about the ending of this film particularly, I think that's where your point is definitely most salient, because the ending of the book and the ending of the film leave the viewer with perhaps leave the viewer with 2 different points of view about how these artists view violence and Alex's journey and even the concept of free will. So yeah, I think you're right that the book has something to say in our conversation, but I also think you're right when we say that we should kind of look at these things as 2 distinct forms of art with 2 distinct aesthetic criteria. So I love this movie. This is one of my favorite films. As I said in the introduction, I think that this is one of the most important films of the 20th century, and a lot of that has to do with some of the themes that we're going that Kubrick is playing with, and same thing with the book as well. But I think one of the themes, and Shira, you talked about this a lot in sort of our pre-show conversation, where you were talking about how this is one of the themes that this film is presenting and deploying is a theme similar to other films of the 1970s, where it's all about youth and youth revolt. Like, I'm right now, I'm just like paraphrasing what you said. So, what? Tell me what you. Let's get it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, so in a lot of horror movies, especially during this time period, you'll actually see that there's this theme of youth being very horrific to the older people. Youth is going to come in, they're going to be the ones taking over, they're going to basically change all of society, almost to the point where you probably won't recognize it, you won't feel comfortable within it anymore, you don't understand their language, you don't understand their clothing, you don't understand their music, you don't understand the things that they enjoy so much, and you more and more feel like you're not a part of society. And then as you age and age and age, there's all your friends are dying, you're all alone, and you're just adrift in this. It's a horror movie because you feel completely outside of the world you've always grown up in. And so there's going to be this anger towards the youth and what they're pushing on everybody, but there's also going to be this feeling like you just might as well die. And you see this in the scene where, Alex and his droogs are coming across a homeless man who's singing some old songs from back in the day, and he's just feeling worthless and useless and just fucking kill me. I don't want to live on this planet anymore. You guys are floating around in space and don't care about having any rules or any of the regulations we used to have. And he just felt kind of out of place. You'll see this in a lot of other movies, though, where youth is scary. And you'll see, like in The Omen, this child that's coming in, and what is he up to? What are his powers? What is he going to do to society? So this is one of those really good examples of that fear, especially after the 60s. I mean, come on, that scared the shit out of some old people. The free love and the drug use and all that. That was scary for some old people. They were not used to it.
Right. It's a fear of change. It's a fear of society changing, and that the society that is going to replace the one that you as an adult grew up with is going to be radically more violent, radically more lascivious, and radically and is going to come up and kill you quite literally. You're right that that's a fear that was going on in the early 70s and 1960s, where there was a sort of youth and revolt, and then of course the adults got scared shitless because of how active and to their point of view, radically different the youth of the 1960s was going to be from their youth. So yeah, I mean, I think that you're onto something there when you're talking about how that is a fear that was present in the culture at the time. Now, I don't think that A Clockwork Orange is supporting that fear. That is to say that I don't think the creators behind this film also believe that youth is inherently violent and that the young kids with their long hair and loud music are going to kill us all. Yeah, I don't think that the film is supporting that point of view, but I think it's certainly a relevant period, a relevant theme around that time period.
I would also want to point out too that this does seem to speak to a deeper fear that we have just as a species. It seems like Jim, I agree with you that I wouldn't think that it would be the directorial choice to say that this is the fear that you should pay attention to and this is what's going to happen. But I even beyond just sort of the time period that this is contextualized in, I think we can go back as far as even ancient Greece and see stories like the Tale of Oedipus about how there is kind of this sort of strand in this theme of, you know, the child rising up to kill the parent. But I do think that probably ties into a little bit of a misattribution that is fundamental to our psychology. So when things go wrong, we tend to blame other. And that's not any different whenever one generation sees changes and then they have sort of dissatisfaction with society. They're going to blame the other, which is the new thing that's coming on. And they seem to think that any change is going to herald disaster and catastrophe. I think even today we see that being the meme of blaming millennials for everything. You know, they're simultaneously deciding not to go out to restaurants, but like they're also destroying this industry and that industry. They're not buying diamonds, they're not buying houses. Literally everything is going wrong because millennials. So yeah, I mean, it's something that I think
always on their phones.
Yeah, right. Phones, but too much. I think this is really just like a deep-seated fear that is highlighted in that time period, but also speaks to a larger sort of trend across human history.
I think you're right, Ben. And one of the things that I want to get into at some point during this podcast, and you're kind of pushing us toward it now, is what does Clockwork Orange have to say about today? And at least in the United States, there's about 40% of the country that definitely wants to go back to the good old days, which of course the halcyon good old days that they're unable to really identify. Nonetheless, there's a real push toward the new, and the current is really scary and changing, and I don't like it. Please bring me back to my cocoon. And I think that's one of the things that Clockwork Orange is bringing up in our discussions, and yeah. So I think that's sort of an important point as we go forward. Other important points, other things that I think were really interesting about this is, I mean, this film in its plot, in its structure, in its mise en scène, its milieu, its art direction, in all of the cinematography, which we'll talk about in greater detail later. There's a lot of sexual and sexuality imagery. Like, this is one of the most phallic movies that I could possibly identify. And so one of the things, like, how are masculinity and femininity portrayed in this film, and how is sexuality portrayed in this film? I think that's one of the other themes that we really have to talk about, especially as we talk about this celebrated first act of this movie, where it's Alex doing his rape and ultra violence with his droogs. I think that's the section of this film that's most often cited, and it's the section that gets the most attention. And so, but it's also the section that's all about sex and sexuality. What do we have to say about some of those themes as they relate to this movie?
There's a lot of innuendos in this movie. It's all over the place.
I don't even think it's innuendos. I think it's just endos or whatever.
Just endos.
There's no, it's just endo. That's not even the real word, but it's not even innuendo. It's direct showing of all of the things.
It's very, very, very sexual. In fact, it was rated X. Which is, it's crazy that it wanted the words that it did with it being rated X. That's kind of unheard of in most films, which is why a lot of people adjust and edit to get to that R rating, but this one was not, so hooray. But I think it was Noah that recently went to this sexual museum. I don't remember what he called it. I don't remember what the museum was, but they had a big picture of Alex with the giant statue of the penis from the pussy yoga ladies room. And so I was like, yeah, of course they have a Clockwork Orange in this museum. Are you fucking kidding me? If you're gonna have sexual shit in your museum, it probably should have a Clockwork Orange art. But yeah, it's there are points in this movie where when I read the book, I was like, okay, So they adjusted some of these scenes a little bit. They made this a lot more artistic for the film. They made it a little bit more palatable, if you will, in the fast forwarding of the threesome, and also by making the girls a lot older than they were in the book. There were a lot of sexual aspects of the film that were easier to watch as opposed to maybe the elements of the book. I don't know if that adjusts what the theme of the book was at all, though. But one of the things that I found very interesting in the writer and wife scene, I've found out that they had continued to try to film that scene. It just wasn't working out. It just felt super dark and not quite right, and it wasn't what they wanted. And then Malcolm McDowell said that he wanted to improvise, and he decided he was going to do Singing in the Rain. Someone said, "Oh, you can't do that. It's copywritten. Well, how are we going to get a copyright on it?" And Kubrick was like, "No, fuck this. We're going to do Singing in the Rain. You deal with that. That's your job. You argue with people. We're just going to film this shit." And so he improvised and did the dancing and the singing and added that. It's almost like a whimsy to this horrible situation, you know? I don't know how you guys feel about that scene. That's one of those really controversial scenes to most people. Whereas for me, I thought it was fucking pure art. I think it depicts this idea of how do we trust people? Who do we trust? Like, when we let someone come cross our boundaries, like, how do we let that affect us later on in life? I think there's a lot of elements of sex being that boundary, right? The idea that when we have sex with someone, we are vulnerable. And the idea of home being kind of like your body and kind of like your boundaries in your personal body. And then we get into consent and all that shit, of course. But I don't know if you guys had that interpretation from the scene of the boundaries and the breaking into people's like homes as well as breaking into people's bodies. I don't know. I would like to hear your guys' opinion.
I mean, you said a lot there that I want to kind of pick up on. Ben, do you want to go before I do? Because I might talk for a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess the direction that I kind of want to take on this, and I want to look at it comprehensively, because I do think that the other scenes, there's kind of a range here of effects and usages of sexual imagery and actions. So, for instance, in that scene in the movie now, like, obviously I think it is a little bit different in the book and perhaps depicted a little bit worse, but in the movie, whenever he walks into the music shop and he's there and he meets two young ladies, there seems to be no force, there seems to be no anger, like malintent. It just seems to be a natural occurrence that I don't necessarily think would be construed as negative in any particular way. I'm not sure. Like, just taking it for what it was, I don't think that scene could be portrayed as being negative. Perhaps just, youth being youth and doing what youth does. However, in other parts of the movie, particularly with the rape scene with the writer and his wife, or with the yoga lady, like, obviously it takes a completely different energy, and there is, I think, a strong theme there about boundaries and how you put up boundaries around particular urges and what makes them healthy versus not healthy. That, I think, leads into a really good discussion about toxic masculinity in this movie, and I think that's really where you can start to think about taking that penis sculpture and literally killing a resisting woman with it, right? Like, I think that's the perfect analogy for toxic masculinity, but taken it really is about that boundary. But also I think that kind of bleeds into the discussion that we might have a little bit later about how society sort of manipulates the behavior of Alex and his friends, and how he uses that kind of a manipulation, right? When he comes to the door, he says, my friend's out here, there's been a horrible crash, he's dying on the road, I need to come in. I think that the point of the rest of the movie is to teach how the government, in fact, seems to be instilling that kind of behavior and that mentality in the people. Like, obviously he becomes a tool for the government by the end of the film. It really doesn't seem to matter what the truth is. It's really just about power plays and about getting what you want. And we see that at all levels of the society in A Clockwork Orange. So I think that's really kind of like a microcosm, perhaps, of the rest of the story we see in the rest of the films, whenever he's going to the door and kind of using that emotion and that seemingly innocuous request, you know, asking for help from your common man to come in and do these terrible things.
Yeah, I that whole talk about a free society and what you're kind of leading us toward, I think is really salient in the second act, but it's set up right here in the first act in the Singing in the Rain scene. And I think one of the things that's really both interesting but also incredibly uncomfortable about this film is the way it portrays rape and sexuality. It does so with so much irony, as even the rape scene in the theater where Alex and his friends come upon Billy and his friends, who, and in the narration Alex says they're getting ready to do a little bit of the old in out on a clamoring debauch guy. I might miss the adjective there, but essentially what he's saying is they're about to have sex with her. He doesn't seem to register it as they're about to rape this woman. So there seems to be, for Alex at least, no distinction between consensual sex and non-consensual rape. And the way each of these scenes is overplayed with the non-diegetic music, where we have, well, diegetic music in the Singing in the Rain scene and non-diegetic music in the theater scene, is both of them are played as though there's a jaunty irony to it, as though this is, and in some ways that makes these scenes a little bit more palatable. It makes these scenes a little bit easier to watch on the surface, but then when you start to sort of have meta feelings about your own feelings, when you're like, wait, I shouldn't be comfortable watching this, even though this music is trying to make me comfortable watching this. And I think Kubrick is masterful in starting out in the wide shot, where we get this kind of jaunty, I'm singing in the rain, and he's doing these horrible acts while punctuating each end of the line. But then there's one shot where he uses a close up on the woman. You actually see that this is one of the worst moments of her life. And so it's a weird scene, and it's weirdly structured, because we get this music that's attempting to make us comfortable with this stuff at the same time when the director is visually reminding us that this is uncomfortable and in fact horrible. So the question becomes, is this sort of an ethical way of shooting a rape scene, or is something more ethical, something like what Gaspar Noé does in Irreversible, where he stays on it and he just wants to show you this scene in its raw brutality. I don't know what's more effective. I think that this is effective for what this film is trying to do, but both of them seem to have their ethical boundaries that they're playing with. And I find that to be eminently interesting about this movie, and the fact that it's portraying sex and rape, at least for Alex in that first act, as being interchangeable, tells us a lot about his character, and tells us about a lot about the culture that this world is going into. We can talk more about sexuality and femininity as well, but I wanted to say that about that Singing in the Rain scene, since both of you kind of brought that up and we're talking about that.
Yeah, when it comes to the music, making it easier to maybe sit through, for some reasons that's actually better for me. It's easier for me to sit through those things. The other movies like Last House on the Left and other films where they depict stuff a little bit more realistically, yeah, I have a hard time with those scenes. Whereas with the scenes from A Clockwork Orange, they almost seem not even like it doesn't even show really much of anything. In fact, when the giant cock goes smashing into the girl's face, it turns into a painting of a mouth growing outward. It doesn't even show any really graphic violence. What's interesting is with the consensual scene, I find it interesting that in all the rape scenes, it's in other locations, whereas the consensual sex is happening within his own confines of his room and his comfort zone. But also, I found that scene really interesting because, by the way, 28 minutes of filming for that scene, cut down to that little tiny bit. And also, they thought if they could fast forward it, it would keep it okay and not rated X. They still rated it X because they were afraid, not because they thought it was that bad, but because they were afraid if they didn't rate that X, that pornography would then just fast forward their videos to try to stay out of being rated X, and they could find a loophole. They wanted to make sure a loophole didn't come up from that scene. So
that's hilarious.
So that scene was an attempt at actually crossing a boundary, interestingly enough. And they were like, oh, we know what you're up to, Kubrick. It's not going to work. So I don't know.
What's amazing about that scene is how well it fits with the music. That it's just, that's a masterclass in editing, and I have no idea how they could do a 28-minute scene and still be able to get it choreographed in exactly the right way. I mean, this is, on a technical level, this film is a fucking masterwork. But yeah, I think you're right that this is I don't know. We'll talk more about the technicalities a little bit later. But my God, that's it. You're right. 28 minutes of filming, and that's a fantastic little bit of trivia there. Yeah, I think let's sort of return to this this conversation about how masculinity and femininity are treated. One of the great comments from one of our regular listeners, Byron, says, "How do you detoxify masculinity? And also, where can I get a shirt reading Detoxifying Masculinity?" And I don't know if this film offers an answer on that. I think this film is definitely trying to deal with that toxic masculinity, as you pointed out, Ben, with him smashing the penis on the person's face. And then also in the costume design where the
cod pieces.
Exactly. I mean, there's one moment where Alex is in a conflict with Dem, and he very specifically straddles Dem, pauses, waits a moment so that his cod piece is right in front of Dem's face, and it's a obvious sign of like, you are going to suck my dick now, before he then straddles him. This is, in every case of Alex and his droogs, it is them invading, attempting to put the penis on other men and other women. It's even when Alex strikes Dem, he does so in the quote unquote yarbles in the balls. All of this is it's so phallocentric that it's impossible to miss that this film is playing with the penis. It's playing with the ideas of how much toxic masculinity invades the youth and the process of growing up. So yeah, I think this is it's fundamental to understanding the first act of this movie, is how masculinity is portrayed.
Even his pet was a dick.
Even his pet was a dick. Well, that's the other. I mean, that's one thing. Is you've got that scene where Alex is masturbating to Beethoven, and you get one of the on his wall is a woman with her legs spread, and what is the snake doing? Going right up into her vagina. And then, of course, there's religious symbolism that goes along with that as well. There's a little bit of Adam and Eve parallels there. It does. I mean, the film does relate sex to evil as within the Christian symbology. What about femininity? What about the way women were portrayed in this film? Did that strike any of you as well?
Yeah, I was a little bit confused about that, I honestly would say. Whenever I think about that theme, the one thing that really sticks out in mind to me is how Alex's mother seems to only be able to cry in response to a lot of different situations. Any sort of like emotional swell results in her breaking down in tears. And so I I'm tempted to say that Kubrick was just showing kind of like that stereotype of feminine weakness. And that might have been just to sort of highlight his use of phallus as power, right? And I think that's fairly that's not controversial. It's like the phallus is used in this movie to be a symbol of power. And so like maybe his depiction of femininity would be to do the exact opposite. But I'm also thinking of, again, like Yoga Lady or whatever, Cat Lady, I think she was mentioned as in the newspaper in the film.
Catwoman is
Catwoman,
the
excuse me, yes, Catwoman. She fought back, and she might have been really the only woman to ever in this film in any scene like fight back against Alex, against anyone else. Like obviously there's a lot of rape going on, and so that can be depicted as a struggle, but it's also sort of depicted as like she's sort of at the mercy of these men who are taking advantage of her. And really, I mean, this Catwoman seems to be the only one who kind of like stood up against this, and like I'm standing, I'm confronting you, I'm trying to hit you. She does hit him, but then ultimately gets crushed by the penis, right? So I'm not sure. Like I think it's not very kind to the feminine perspective.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about that character, she was the one who didn't consent. She's like, no, get the fuck away from my house. Leave. And he's like, well, thank you anyway. And then crunch, crunch away in the rocks, but he still broke into her home. And this plays into a common fear, which, hey, I'm going to give a shout out to the Lobster all of a sudden. Hey, guess what? It goes into that common fear for women of living alone. And, someone might break in and then you don't have anybody there to protect you. And then you're vulnerable. But she gets her home broken into. And even though she was independent, she's literally living the dream. Honestly, this is where most women would like to be. You have a big, giant, nice house, a bunch of cats, and you don't have to deal with anybody's bullshit, and you tell them to fuck off. That's great. She also did everything that you're supposed to do that we always yell at the horror movie lady. Call the cops. She did. She called the cops. She's like, this was just really odd. I don't feel comfortable. And the cop's like, well, I'm going to come over and visit anyway. She's like, well, if you think so, that's fine. It's just so interesting how much she did everything she was supposed to do. But the real thing that did her in was deciding to be alone. And that's the ultimate fear. I think they're making us buy into that fear in a way with that kind of a scene. But is there truth to that? I don't fucking know. I mean, it is really scary being a woman alone. And a lot of guys don't realize what we go through just walking through a dark parking lot, walking with keys between our knuckles and worried about if someone's underneath our car or behind, in the back seat of our car, or, is someone going to try to hurt or harm us? Even just being around people we know, but we're alone with them. Are they going to try something? Are they going to force themselves? We live in these constant fears. Like, is it justified to live in these fears or not? Probably. Like, she should have called the cops. She should have been concerned about someone knocking on her door late at night saying, I need help. That is concerning, why should that be concerning? People should be able to ask for help, and you should be able to trust that. This is not a good society if we can't even trust that. And so she's a very interesting character because she does portray a lot of what women probably would like to live like, but what they're afraid to live like. And maybe for good reason. And as much as that might not be great, it does reflect our society still today in a way.
I think it definitely, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that it reflects our society today. I mean, it's no surprise that many women that I know carry some form of self-defense, either a mace or one of those little cat things where they, you know what I'm talking about. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. Where it looks like a cat, but it's actually a fucking weapon. There's a cat keychain. It's something that's not part of
which they made illegal to carry with you in Texas.
Cool.
Yeah. So you can't even try to protect yourself as a woman. Apparently, they're totally fine with people walking around with guns, but
Is that what they
cat
said?
keychain.
Is that
It's
what
a
they said?
little too
You can't have a
dangerous.
keychain, but you can have an automatic weapon.
I was like, God, come
That
on.
makes sense. That's all right. Yeah, I
Whatever.
like her society too. What about some of the other women in the film? It struck me that in the second act scene where they're testing Alex and testing the method that whether or not it worked on him, there's a woman that he is presented with, and she is just parts. Like she is not. She has no agency in that moment. Her face is a blank slate. The camera zooms in on her breasts, and she's only parts. And we get this one sort of reverse shot where it's from behind, and she kind of breaks character and does a little bow and curtsy and runs and scampers off. So it does kind of make it think that this was just a role that she was playing. But still, like I think you're right, Ben, when you talk about the mother character. All she does is cry. The female character in the theater, in the testing scene, she is all parts. The Catwoman is murdered by the penis. There is the nurse who just seems kind of always happy and just delighted, and there's the other nurse that's fucking the doctor. All of these women sort of seem to be subservient to men, and normally in most films I would say that this is sort of a myopic view of women and femininity, and this would be the part where I use feminist criticism and say, well, you're a bad movie. But I think that this film might be a little bit more pointed in its criticisms. I think it is trying to call out these forms of these archetypical forms of masculinity and femininity as subjects of satire rather than simply reproducing the cultural ideas of masculinity or femininity. I mean, that's really the central question here: is this reproducing the cultural ideas of masculinity and femininity, or is this making fun of them? And I seem to think that it's making fun of them, but I don't know if the rest.
I feel the comedy as well. I think that that's part of the editing and how the song choices. I feel like they were trying to be somewhat comical in some ways, although these are dark subjects that some people will say you can't be humorous about. But when you're talking about the mocking of society and a cultural creation of what a girl is and what a guy is, what women are supposed to be and what men are supposed to be, that kind of satire is, I think, fully justified. But I almost wonder if it's not about masculine and feminine so much as it is about power and powerless, is the real wrestle that's going on here. Of course, we can use masculine and feminine to fully tell that story because it's something we're familiar with, but maybe like the actual deeper theme that they're talking about is the powerful and the powerless and that constant battle that's going on. And in that respect, that's why they're using women in these kinds of roles and men in these kinds of roles, because it's trying to call out the minority status of women and the minority status of prisoners and the minority status of, so many different types of people in our society, homeless people. Too. Yeah. And I mean, we even see this kind of come out near the end when Alex happens upon his droogs and they're cops now. And now the power has flipped and we have one of the most horrific fucking scenes, holy shit, of the drowning of Malcolm McDowell, which, by the way, was actually filmed in real time. As you're sitting there wondering how he's holding his breath, they are really holding him under.
But he has an oxygen mask that he slips on, I hear.
He said that he now, because they used a broth to give it that, trough feel. He says he still to this day gets sick from smelling that particular soupy broth smell, because that was actually a very psychologically damaging scene that he actually was part of. And what's interesting about that scene, once again, we have that comic effect that occurs there where the cops are shoving him into the trough. He's drowning and they're hitting him. Now, this would normally be a very this is a horrible scene, but they have these funny sound effects. Wang, byong, wyong, and it's like, what? it's like a fucking Tom and Jerry cartoon. What the hell is happening here? And it's these weird comic effects added to these horrific, scenes that it's kind of confusing, but you kind of get an idea what they're trying to say too, right? Like, we're going to make this palatable, but we're really trying to just tell you, like, violence is bad. Power that is misused is bad. Invading people's boundaries, bad. These are all bad things. Maybe you shouldn't do these things. And we shouldn't have to experiment on you to tell you it's a bad thing.
Right. Well, I think that one of the central points you made, which I think is really, really smart, is you're talking about the power and the powerless. And in our society, the way we have constructed masculinity and femininity, you cannot talk about masculinity and femininity without also talking about power and power constructions. Power and power constructions are essential to conversations about masculinity and femininity. They're essential to conversations about class. They're essential to conversations about race. They're essential to conversations about all kind of disability issues, all of queer issues as well. They're essential to all of these kinds of issues. That power dynamics are at the heart of these things. So I don't know. What about you, Ben? Do you want to weigh in on this this aspect of the film?
Yeah, sure. No, I think, Sherry, your perspective on that makes a lot of sense, actually. And so, like, narratively throughout the course of the film, I think that what we see is sort of the beginning of the smaller ideas that sort of expand to a larger sort of frame as we kind of get closer to the end of the movie. And so, if you do take kind of like that one initial story between, masculine and feminine, kind of like in that first act, and you understand that as just an analogy for power structures. I do think what you're saying, though, I mean, it makes a really easy transition from, Alex and his friends as rapists to the police using their nightsticks and bending him over a trough and beating them with the clubs, as a show of power and a sort of like very kind of a masculine versus feminine sort of imagery there, to ableism, like the able, like the big bodyguard guy who lifts his weights and stuff like that and protects the dude in the wheelchair. So there's able versus disabled. And then we do finally take that to the grandest scale of, government versus citizen. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And if we do take this movie as kind of like a satire, then I think it makes a lot more sense too, to be able to sort of see this, each individual piece is kind of like one smaller story that sort of weaves into a larger narrative about bigger ideas, yeah. So I do think that makes a lot of sense.
Also, can I just point out something about the guy who carries the writer after the writer gets injured and has to be in a wheelchair? That is actually Darth Vader.
Yes, David Prowse.
Darth Vader. And a funny argument that happened on set with him carrying the wheelchair. So he was carrying the wheelchair. Stanley Kubrick says, "Hey, I need you to carry the wheelchair up and down the stairs." And he's like, "No, I'm not going to fucking do this shit. You're not the one take director. I'm not going to keep carrying around a man in a wheelchair. Like, this is not my job." And, Kubrick laughed. Instead of firing him or getting mad at him, he laughed. And he's like, "All right, we'll try to do it in as little takes as possible. You're right." And so they were able to do it in 6 takes, which I guess everybody was okay with. But apparently there was an argument about the carrying of the writer. Right. But I love that scene, though. That is such a great scene. I'm glad that they worked it out and managed to put that in there, because there's once again that power and powerless, but this is where they're working together, right? The powerful is actually helping the person who's harmed and hurt, not only physically, but also helping him deal with the monster that hurt and harmed him in the first place. Even working in cahoots with him to poison him with the wine and make him pass out, and to put him in the creepy room and to play the music loudly. And goddamn, I just have to say, the juxtaposition between the opening scene where you're panning out to see Alex, which is one of my favorite opening scenes to any movie ever. They juxtapose it with the writer playing the music, and then you pan out and you see all of the people that are just hanging out with him, letting him get his justice, and oh my God, fantastic fucking writing. But I love the idea of the powerful being able to help the powerless is another option out there. So
Right. And that is in that case, but in many other cases, we do have the powerful taking advantage of the powerless. I think no conversation about the themes of sexuality and rape in this film are complete without talking about the scene between the headmaster and Alex, where he does sexually assault Alex, or at least seem to attempt to. Yeah, there's a hand on the balls, and that's a form of sexual assault. It's a form of rape. Well, it's certainly a form of sexual assault, and that is. So the idea that this is just limited to Alex and his droogs ignores that really, I think, important point, is that when we have powerful people, a lot of other people can be powerless, including Alex, who just the night before was, inflicting his power on other people. So,
I do want to point out too, like before we move on, and hopefully this doesn't jump ahead
Sure.
too much, but I absolutely love that the writer ends up being thrown in jail. Because him working together with his bodyguard to try and find justice, the powerful and powerless coming together, and ultimately as a propagandist or like a revolutionary trying to bring what could potentially be positive change to the government, ends up just getting thrown in prison as a political prisoner. And like we even get scenes in the prison as the warden's talking about, well, we need to clear out these common criminals because we're probably going to need room for political prisoners. Yeah, I don't know. It's amazing how that kind of just gets sort of seeded through the larger story.
Well, and then it totally shits on the prison system, right? It's explaining why they do it. There's reasons why they imprison the people that they do. They're not actually trying to protect our streets. They're not actually trying to help other citizens. They're doing things for a form of control, and that's very uncomfortable for many people to try to consider. It's something that still to this day people argue that is not a thing, but it totally is a fucking thing when the exact same crimes happening in the same exact ways have different timelines or different ways of
modes of punishment.
Yeah. Right. It's very uncomfortable for people to. We have a just world fallacy in this society. We think that everything should be just, and so they are just. It's just not the truth. And that's what was so great about the writer, right? He's trying to get his own justice. Nope. Sorry, you don't get that.
Yeah,
horrible.
this is, Ben, you and I are doing the Shortcut series where we're creatively adding to other films and we're talking about sort of pitches for other movies. A pitch I had as I was watching this film again was I want the political drama of A Clockwork Orange. Like, what's going on behind the scenes? What is this government like? What are the, I want kind of a wag the dog of Clockwork Orange, or a one of those kind of dramas where we're getting into maybe even like a West Wing of the Clockwork Orange world. That would be amazing.
I'm just imagining the camera, and then you have Alex and his droogs walking down hallways, talking very fast.
Well, I mean, I'm less concerned with. I think Clockwork Orange tells the story of Alex and his droogs very well, but I'm really interested in the prime minister, the minister, that character, the one who's feeding Alex at the end. Like, I'm interested in his character. I want a West Wing style show that centers on that guy. I think it would be.
Well, that character perfectly depicts what is actually still going on today. We have politicians that are only concerned about staying in power. They do not actually care about what's best for everybody. They do not care about anything but themselves and their pocketbooks, and they are willing to do anything and everything and take away all of their, morality just to remain in power. And this is the danger that's still happening. Like, it's as long as we are allowing this kind of money and corporations, especially now, intervening with a lot of our politics, it's very dangerous, because now people are just going to want to be in it for the money, not to actually benefit society, not to actually represent the citizens. Scary. Mm-hmm. It is scary.
I mean, that gets us into the second act of this film, and it gets us into some of the other themes in this film. I'm going to offer up my interpretation of this movie and let you guys kind of tell me whether or not I'm an asshole and whether or not I'm crazy. But my interpretation of the film's thesis is that one of the costs of a free society is a world where rape and violence cannot be absolutely prevented. And that has to, and to sort of support that, this film characterizes the worst thing. One of the worst things happening to the main character is not that he's put in prison, is not that he is racked with guilt about what he's done, but rather that free will has been taken away. And so it seems as though my interpretation of this film is that it is trying to tell us that free will is almost more important than the other acts of violence, that the stripping of free will is a greater crime, is worse thing to happen to a person than the rape and violence that we see in the first act. And if that's the thesis of this film, that one of the causes of a free society is that rape and violence cannot be prevented, that's a damn hard truth. Like, that is a really fucking hard truth to live with. That in order to be free, we kind of have to put up with the fact that rape and violence are going to be aspects of our society. Maybe my interpretation of the film's thesis is off. Maybe you guys have something to say about it. But
this was in another film too, where they discussed this. I believe it was Minority Report, where they basically have it where they can tell what crimes you're going to eventually do, and they start imprisoning people before the crimes can actually occur. But should we be imprisoning someone for a possible future crime, even if they haven't done it yet? Is that okay? Is there any kind of morality to that? At what point are we going to start deciding what things are criminal? In my opinion, yeah, we're not going to eliminate everything, but goddamn, can we just educate people? Is that fucking possible? And that is the thing that's actually, we're getting a wall all the time. People don't want to talk about sex. They don't want to talk about consent. They don't want to talk about gender. They don't want to talk about men and women. They don't want to talk about any of our differences. You cannot mention that there are LGBT members raising children. You can't talk about any of these things in the schools. We cannot educate children that differences occur. And I think the consequences of not understanding the differences of others and not accepting people is a huge part of the problem. Now, that won't solve everything. I'm not trying to run for president or anything, but I think education's a huge part of it. And in the Clockwork Orange world, we don't know what his education is. He's not really going to school anyway, but it's pretty clear that most of the people are ignorant. It's pretty clear that Alex is pretty ignorant of things. His school and his parents and all the people that are supposed to be, helping raise him up, they're either enabling or they're hurting or harming or sexually assaulting him. He doesn't have any adult role models to help him understand what's right and wrong and what we should know, and what do we as a society need to do to help help these kids? It's such a stupid theme.
No, that's the perfect question to ask in this movie, though. And I do think, though, that I take a little bit of a different interpretation than Jim here. Free will is absolutely at the core of this movie. And I think it's really interesting that you brought up what we could do and about education and stuff, because I think that is the answer. And I think even this story, I will say, points to that answer. But from my take, what I really see is the depiction of free will as being almost non-existent throughout the entire movie. So I really think that the point is to say, at the beginning, it looks like he's making these choices. And then when we go into the treatment scene, it's very obvious that free will, what we think he has as free will, can be taken away and he can be made to do different things. But by the end, we get kind of the final aha there, that he can be put back exactly the way that he was, which sort of suggests that those choices were controlled from the beginning anyway. And the control was coming from the social context and the way he was raised and all these different influences on a person's life. And I think really, of course, that goes back to the nature versus nurture debate. But I do think that you know, in this film at least, and in this story, it's the nurture that really seems to be the driving force for the horrible things that are happening in this society. And perhaps those decisions are made because no politicians think it's profitable to clean up crime. I could definitely see that as being kind of like a narrative that we could draw and would be perfectly at home in A Clockwork Orange. But one of the big reasons why I really, really love the book is because whenever we get that final resolution, it does point to that answer that you're talking about, Shayra, because, you know, at the end of the film, we see, well, he's given this great life as a political ploy and as a manipulation so that he can be used as a tool to keep the current government in power. So he's given all these great things. We don't see what happens after that. Well, spoilers, what happens after that is that he becomes a reasonable, functional member of society. You know what I'm saying? Like,
The
once you
21st
give
chapter.
yeah, once you give people the means and you put them in a healthy context, then they have, you know, just a better social situation. They tend to make better choices. And he doesn't stay as a rapist. He doesn't stay as a murderer. He goes to his job and he goes to a bar and he sees some of his friends, and it's, you know, that's pretty much the end of it, right? So, like, I mean, I really do think that's the resolution here, is that certain manipulations can be put in place in a society by a government to have better outcomes, but ultimately free will is kind of an illusion, and it really does determine, or it does depend almost entirely on those influences and those contexts.
I have a lot of friends that are, you know, in the they're in their mid-age situation, but they still like to play their rock music and stuff. And I have continuously tried to tell those middle-aged guys that are still like playing their rock music, I'm like, you need to name your band The 21st Chapter. Like, it's hilarious. It's a hilarious idea. Like, you have your job and you have your side gig, you know. Like, that would be a fucking hilarious name to a band. Nobody's taken me up on it because they think it's too obscure, but I think it's really like a funny idea of throughout your youth, you had this rebellious nature and you're like, fuck my parents, and, you know, this angry anarchy symbols. And then all of a sudden you're just like, okay, I go to work and, and I contribute to society and everything's fine. I still like to play rock music though. But that is kind of the most interesting aspect of what the story does to Alex. It seems like at the end, Kubrick hints at the idea that he's only been encouraged to continue to be bad, though. But I mean,
Yeah.
that's
I think you're both sort of pointing to the ending as this answer to the question about free will and all that, and I think that, you know, I do want to talk about that ending, and I do want to talk about the 21st chapter for some people who perhaps have not read the book but have seen the film. You know, we'll talk about like whether or not Alex is cured at the end, but kind of to I do differ from you slightly, Ben, is that I understand where you're coming from, and I think that you make some interesting points that that the film is talking about how we never actually have free will, that it is all sort of a map of societal factors, and, you know, you can almost predict how somebody is going to behave based upon societal factors. But if I were to attempt to give a person an education and a sense of culture, one of the things I might start with would be classical music. I might ask that person to be more familiar with Beethoven than he is with Slooshy. What is the Slooshy Slew or whatever it is? It's some dumb band name that one of the girls mentioned, and he takes that tape deck out of the player before he puts in his Beethoven to masturbate with. I think that Alex is a cultured person. I guess I'm kind of differing with both of you a little bit. He is a cultured person. He's a relatively educated person. He's socially adaptable. He has his droogs. He understands the world in which he's working in the first act of the film. And then all of that is taken away from him, and he is left with the inability to make choice, as the chaplain says. So the real crux of this film is in the eye forcing scenes. He is given no choice. He is essentially taken what we understand as free will away. And we are all driven by our societal motives. We are all driven by the senses of masculinity and the senses of class prejudice and the senses of justice just by existing in this world. That sort of super ego mentality that we're all kind of imbued with as members of this culture. But we also all believe ourselves, I believe, I think this is true of most people, we all believe ourselves to be given a certain amount of agency. And it is that agency that's taken away from him in the second act. And so I think that that's really where the crux of this film is. And it's talking, for me, it's talking about how taking away that free will, the ability to make a negative choice, is at the heart of what a free society is. And that's, as I said before, I do think that that's a really uncomfortable truth to wrestle with. And I wouldn't, I guess what I'm saying is I wouldn't so easily dismiss, I think, the agency and the free will that he has, even as a member of the society. I think that's where your and my interpretations differ a little bit, Ben.
I think one rebuttal that I would have, or one, not necessarily a rebuttal, but a counter argument, just to go ahead and throw this out. So I do see that, parallel to what you're saying, one of our members of the chat here, Evan, was talking about the one point that Kubrick wanted to make. It wasn't a lack of education, culture, family, etc., that made him evil. Yes, he does seem somewhat culture-like. Obviously, he does seem to be gifted of tongue, and he does enjoy classical music. But we also find out that his parents have no idea what he's up to at night. They're asleep by the time he gets home. They really don't seem to take care of him. They don't keep tabs on him. They don't care whether or not he goes to school. And as far as his relationships with his friends, well, it seems to be, once again, like another power relationship. I wouldn't necessarily call those healthy relationships, because he seems to be very clearly just sort of using them. He has no problem being violent with him. And in the end, that's kind of what turned them against him, is that they sort of got tired of it, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily say that all the signs are there that he has sort of like this perfect sort of healthy life. He just seems to be a little bit off. But I do think it is an interesting discussion. Like, even if, let's say, taking your perspective, that choice to make a negative action is at the core of this movie, I do still think that's a very interesting line of thought to take, and a very interesting discussion to be had about that.
Cool. What do you think, Shayra?
Yeah, so I agree with what Ben is saying. Yes, there were definite signs that, he had everything together. But the thing is we have this idea that if mom and dad are in the picture, and if they, are working hard, and if they provide food and shelter and clothing and everything that their child needs, then everything's good. That's not the case. And we see this popping up even today, probably more so today. A lot of the youth that act out are kids in suburban households that have an upper middle class lifestyle, that have everything that they could ever possibly want. They're completely taken care of in most cases. And the thing is we tend to blame the parents still when they act out, when they tend to do horrible things to people. We go, oh, what did the parents do? What did the parents do? Well, they did everything that society tells them to do. But is that the right thing? And we are starting to see studies about, authoritarian parenting, or the more enabling type of parenting. Like, what is the right parenting style? Is it the parents' fault? Is it the teacher's fault? Is it the school's fault? There is something to be looked into as far as how people are raised and what they're taught and what they are, what they are raised around. But this was actually brought up in A Clockwork Orange. If you look at where he was raised at, his parents were working too hard, and they did not have time to pay attention to their kid. Mom was going to the factory again. She can't fucking pay attention to every little place that he is at every little hour. She's probably working 2 jobs. Who knows? She's working her ass off, and they're living in the projects. He can't even go in the elevator at one point. Oh God, someone destroyed it. Okay, this fucking sucks. They are bringing up what it's like to be raised in an urban setting where everything is kind of gone to shit, and where people are always working. This is what we live in today. It was a prophecy of our future. People are working so hard. Mom and dad, even if they are together, are working 2 or 3 jobs each. They don't have time to spend time with little Johnny anymore. And as much as they want to try to like be there for him, they can't. And even if you do live in a suburb, you're still working your ass off most of the time. But let's say you have the perfect household. Mom stays home all day. You're living in the suburbs. Whenever the kid wants his freaking rock t-shirts, he gets them. Everything's perfect. What if he still acts out? What if he still decides on violence? Why? Have you enabled him in that way? Like, there's so many questions. Like, what causes people to behave this way? And I mean, honestly, this whole argument, this whole discussion came really to God, it was like on almost every news station and almost every single television back in Columbine, when Columbine happened. Like, who do we blame for this? Why are these youth acting out? Why would they do such a thing? Now it's becoming more and more common that kids will do this stuff. We have mass shootings happening all the time. And this kind of thing actually happened with A Clockwork Orange in a way. When it came out, there were some acts of violence that occurred. Stanley Kubrick was blamed for it. And there were people threatening him and his family. They were saying they were going to kill him. This is why it took his death to come for the film to even, you know, really be allowed to be played again. Because he was refusing it to be out there. Whose fault is it? Is it media? Is it family? Is it school?
Well, it was. I mean, I don't know if it was banned. Like, the film itself was not banned. It has been on AFI's list for prior to Kubrick's death. So
it's been on lists, but he made it so it wouldn't be played in certain areas because he was getting threats to his family. And I think it was in England where they banned it.
I hadn't heard that part.
But like it wasn't just threats to him, it was threats to his family where they were actually threatening to go into his home and kill and rape the family, Alex style. They were very creative with their ways of saying they were going to attack him. And it was because they were blaming him for acts of violence that were happening around the area based off of his movie. So there's almost like a postmodernism to this film in that, like, what causes the violence? Is it this movie that's causing the violence? I don't fucking know. Like, who do we blame? Do we just blame the person's free will?
Well, it's really interesting that you brought up Columbine, because I think one of the things that came up during that period too is like a lot of people would blame like violent music, you know, Marilyn Manson or whatever, like maybe the drug problem or maybe video games. And everyone kind of wants to find sort of the easy sort of answer to that, say, well, if we just removed this one thing from society, that's going to clean up the whole thing. That being said, I think the other side of that too is at the heart of this, and especially what Jim is talking about, kind of like the gun debate in the United States. And I'm not even sure if I should really bring this up because it's probably going to get our video taken off of YouTube. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one huge question that we deal with now, at least in this country, is, you know, does taking this thing away, does taking this choice away, this choice to do a negative thing, also prevent other positive things that might happen? And that's a really tough question, even just for one very sort of narrow kind of type of choice. We're not even talking about, you know, just like the inherent ability to be aggressive or to stand up to people or stand up for yourself, like we see in this movie that was entirely stripped from Alex. You know, his ability to be sexual, he couldn't fight back against injustice. You know, he became you know, a crumpling sort of like I don't want to say a coward, but he was just unable to take any action whatsoever. He was completely ineffectual. And that takes it to an entirely other level. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an absolutely relevant question, right? Like, and it's so tough to answer that, you know, even getting at hardcore in-depth studies with statistics and like really kind of like measuring that out sort of leaves something behind. You know what I mean? I mean, like I really don't want to. I don't want to get into this issue, but I kind of want to yeah, whatever, fuck it. Okay, so like a lot of the arguments
I'm encouraging you.
Thank you, Jim, getting me into trouble. A lot of the arguments that I hear from the pro-gun side, especially like not even just about the Constitution, is that we're trying to safeguard ourselves from potential tyranny and like horrible things that might happen, right? Like that's really kind of like the thing that is brought up all the time, that we kind of need this to protect ourselves. And yes, that's going to cause some bad people to be able to do bad things in a particular way, but in their perspective, we kind of need that so that we can prevent this other worse thing from happening. And I think that's probably what what really is super analogous to Jim, what you were saying about, is the cost of a free society, that people need the choice to be able to do those kinds of terrible things. And that's not something I guess I'm prepared to answer right now on this podcast. You know what I mean?
Right? Same. I keep on trying to argue, like, let's try to educate, let's figure out the root of the problem. And it's like, but Jim, you keep on bringing it up. It's an uncomfortable truth. Maybe there's just some sex and violence that is just going to be there always. And it makes me think of the punk rock song by The Exploited, Sex and Violence. And literally the only lyrics to the song is sex and violence. And it's a total earworm. Go check it out. But every time I watch this movie, that is the song that goes in my head. And maybe it is inevitable. Sex and violence is just fucking inevitable. Should we regulate it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer, and I don't have an answer either. Certainly, and I don't even know if this would be the forum to try to run for president and announce my candidacy. But I think that art can serve multiple functions, right? Like, and one of the functions is asking a really tough question without actually answering it with any degree of completeness. So this, to me, A Clockwork Orange is a giant question that says, one of the costs of a free society is a world where rape and violence cannot be absolutely prevented. What are you going to do about it? Or don't you think? Like, I don't have an answer to it, and I appreciate both of you sort of struggling to answer that question. And it's, that's one of the things that's really good about art, is it sort of leaves us wondering these things, leaves us wondering. Now, I happen to be, for gun control. Does that also mean that I'm disagreeing with Clockwork Orange? I don't think A Clockwork Orange is really making a statement as much as it's asking this, is sort of proposing this idea and requesting us to think about it, requesting us to see to what degree is a free society, dependent upon having to tolerate the fact that there is hate speech and that there are gun crimes and there are sexual assaults in the world. And would we be willing to give up a free society to have all of those things just disappear the next day, and have every rapist or gun murderer or hate speech purveyor immediately start gagging when they're about to say something offensive or do something offensive or violent? Would we be willing to live in that world? Is that what the state's responsibility is? It's not, I don't know if it's really incumbent upon us, or if we are even capable of answering all of those questions, but those are the questions that this piece of art makes me think about. And whether or not I ever come to a conclusion is kind of a different question, different thing. I think these are one of the things that are just part of being in this world and being in a society, is trying to figure out questions like this, not with any particular end in mind, and in fact knowing that there will be no end, that there will be no conclusion.
Well, the other thing that's really interesting about all this is, so we had the struggle of the powerful and the powerless. That we can agree is definitely a part of the theme. And then we talk about free will and, not having that free will, and what that means for how we should legislate, maybe, but maybe even how we educate. But the other thing is, we have to definitely consider the fact that they did bring up police brutality and the misuse of power, and how people who are in position of power may not be so good with it. In fact, it's probably the regular that when people have positions of power that they misuse it, whether they're political or they're police or whatever, whether they're clergy, whatever the fuck they're doing in positions of power, whether they're man, woman. So then what does that mean? We should just sit and accept this shit? Like, no, obviously you kind of want to rebel against it, right? You watch this movie and you're kind of like, no, fuck all this noise. But then what does that mean? Like, have we missed the point? I don't know. Like, there's so many non-solutions to these problems, and it almost feels like there's no hope. it's very hopeless.
I don't know if there's no hope. You know, certainly I'm pessimistic about the world at large. Like, that's just kind of what it's like to be.
I tend to be a pessimist
in 21st century. What?
I tend to be a pessimist a little.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
I think that I would be. Let's just put it this way. I would be careful of any person who offers an easy solution to a complex problem. And that includes people on my side of the aisle. The people who say, oh, well, if we just get rid of all of the guns, then all of the violence goes away. I don't think I don't think it's as simple as that. You know, so I would, as I said, I would be careful of anybody who makes who proposes a simple solution to a complex problem.
Doesn't that seem to be the way of the political process, though? I mean, like, obviously,
yes.
These are very tough questions to answer. And we here, I think, have taken a position of intellectual honesty in admitting that. But I do think people, because they are so complicated, do sort of take very quickly to people who offer those easy answers, right? I mean, and that's something else that you see a lot in this movie is, you know, anyone who is willing to pick up that power and that phallus and ram it down your throat is kind of the person that ends up being put in charge of society as a whole.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah, I think you're right on, Ben. Yeah, I mean, we sort of reduce our complex political discussions to sound bites. That's something that's all.
But it all explains Trump. It really explains.
I mean, I wanted to go the whole podcast without actually mentioning his name.
It's hard not to with this movie.
Yeah,
I feel like it was kind of calling out the future of our politics and the fact that you know, entertainment and violence and sex it's getting to that point where nothing really shocks us anymore. We've become numb to a lot of shit. And so when we hear all these crazy stories, we're just like, people live their lives. So anyway.
Yeah. A Clockwork Orange is actually about the orange president. Dun-dun. All right, we're all done with that. Let's move on. So another question sort of occurred to me, and this is this will get us into discussions of the 21st chapter in the book, but also in the discussions of how the film presents the end. And it's a very simple question. The last line of the film is, I was cured. Is he cured? It's a simple question, but a very complex one to answer. What do you think? Is he cured at the end?
I'd say he's not an expert. That's about where I'll go with that. He's not exactly an expert in that, so
is he cured? But do you like that last image of him having sex and the other people turning sort of cheering him on, and he gets that he's able to slushy aka listen to Beethoven's Ninth. Is this a cure? Is this a moment of cure for him? And this brings us back to like how we view Alex's emotion or character's journey over the course of this movie. Is this a return to his halcyon days of rape and ultraviolence with his droogs, or is there something else in that image that leads you to believe that there's going to be something different going on here? I'm sort of
either the experiment failed
as I ask it, but what?
Either the experiment failed or he died and this was his like hallucination right before the death hit. I mean, that's really the only conclusion I can come to.
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead, Ben.
So what I want to appeal to here is the DSM. And so if we think about what actually classifies psychological disorder, I think it's mostly defined by, is this trait or is this thing actually causing you difficulty in living your everyday life? And so if we think about the effect that Alex had of becoming sick and cowering over whenever he tried to engage in aggressiveness or listen to music, like obviously that's gone. And I don't think before he really saw those behaviors as causing a problem for him in his life. So, you know, from that perspective, I think, yeah, I mean, you could almost say that he was cured because he no longer has that sort of restraint. But also from the other side, if you take, Jim, your perspective about the free will question, I think the resolution there, like probably what we're supposed to draw from the film, is that he's been given back his ability to choose. Now, obviously, from my perspective, I think that what we see is a world in which free will doesn't exist. And so like he was just really honestly just put back to his original state that he was most comfortable with. But in so many ways and in so many layers, I do think, yes, like you could probably see him as being cured. And in the long term, of course, if we take the book's perspective, which is another layer to add on, he was cured honestly by given a better seat in society and having his socioeconomic class raised just a little bit so they didn't have to have that impulse quite as much to engage in certain types of behaviors. So, yeah, I mean, there's like a bunch of different perspectives to look at it from. But in all of those perspectives, I think we could say that he was cured, unless you think that the cure was supposed to be taking away the things that we don't like about him and leave only the things that are good. You know what I mean? Like that's the only way in which you could possibly think, I believe he wasn't cured.
Right. I think it's in that last image, I think it's essential to realize that the woman is on top. And that there's I don't necessarily think that that is a non-consensual act that's occurring there. And so in that sense, I think that's a really important aspect of that final image of the movie. And that she does, I
we now know
she seems to be enjoying it.
We now have the image for the detoxifying masculinity. It's
Alex
being written by a woman. That's how you detoxify masculinity.
So that's great. I think Byron and I were sort of designing a T-shirt for Deadly Analysis merchandise a little while ago, and it was Deadly Analysis detoxifying masculinity, one podcast at a time, and we'll have the final image of a Clockwork Orange where she's riding him, and that would be the final idea of what
women empowerment is sexy as fuck. Okay, like let's just be honest. Okay,
no disagreements there. Happy to agree. Like retweet.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm still left up in the air about that. I might have to go back and review that scene a few more times just to fully appreciate the women being in power and make sure that my understanding and appreciation of the scene artistically is where it needs to be.
Yeah, you definitely have to rewind it a few times, pause on certain images. I think that's all this necessary academic work to correctly understand this film. And make sure you put it on the T-shirt as well. That will never...
You really made me realize that is a positive ending, isn't it? Fuck.
I think so. Like, I think that the book and the film almost accidentally come to a very similar conclusion. The 21st chapter. Okay, so for people who don't know, Ben, you seem to know this maybe much better than I. Can you sum up the 21st chapter? I could probably do it, but it's been a while since I've read the book. But do you want to do that?
Yeah. I can give it a shot. And like I fully admitted, it's been a few years, so I'm not going to be able to cite it word for word. But essentially what happens is that we come into Alex's life a few years later. He's getting off of his job and he goes to like this pub or something like that. And he's sitting there reading a newspaper, having a beer, and he happens to see one of his old friends or one of his old droogs. I think they're in the bar. And so they have like this quick conversation or whatever like that seems like totally innocuous. But the impression given is that the past has been squarely put behind him, that he seems to be fairly healthy. He's not having any like these crazy thoughts. He's definitely not in the position that he used to be. He's not going out at night robbing people, raiding people, killing people. He just seems to be a normal 9-to-5 stiff, right? And going to have a drink after work. I mean, he seems to be fully, completely reformed. And my impression of that might be inaccurate. Of course, like I would be willing to have any of our commenters come in if they've read the book and talk about how I'm totally off base. But that was my impression, is that he just became like a normal dude, right? He seems to be fully integrated, is what the overall point seems to be.
That was my impression as well. Shayra, do you want to jump in on the 21st chapter?
Yeah, I mean, he seemed to just turn into what we all do. And this goes back to the original theme that I was talking about in the beginning, where, you know, old people getting scared of the youth and they're all taking over and they're all rebelling and then guess what? They become fat old fucks too. and the story continues. And this has been repeating throughout history forever and ever.
Yeah, those kids with their long music and loud hair. I'm going to read something from IMDb. Anthony Burgess was raised a strict Roman Catholic, even though he has an obsession with the tarot. He originally wrote this novel as a parable about Christian free will and forgiveness. His take on it was that to be a true Christian, one had to forgive the most horrifying acts, something Burgess knew only too well, having seen his wife be assaulted and beaten by American soldiers during World War II. This attack resulted in a miscarriage and a lifetime of gynecological troubles for his wife. So I think that the final chapter of A Clockwork Orange, where Alex is basically normal, is this parable about forgiveness, about how even after the worst offenses, that one can turn out to lead a normal life, which is certainly something that in our canceled society today, or canceling society today, we may disagree with. And this, that sort of returns us to some of the questions and discussions that we had before. But I certainly think that the film ends up suggesting that Alex is not going to return to his life of rape and ultraviolence. And that also starts in Act 2, when we see Alex having some interest in being good even before he has the procedure. There's the chaplain character that ends up being a sort of, he's the chaplain character ends up saying that Alex doesn't have a choice, objecting to the procedure and even helping Alex along, even though Alex seems to take all the wrong lessons from Christianity, wanting to be a Roman rather than the Christ figure, et cetera, et cetera. So,
man, like that's so fantastic. We haven't really talked about any other religious stuff, like, or at least in depth, and I really appreciate that you read that, because from the story perspective, I think that makes so much sense, right? Like you could almost put him in the place of the writer, no pun intended, really. I mean, honestly, where this horrible person comes into his life and does this terrible thing, but that ultimately he needs to sort of take that turn the other cheek perspective, because redemption can occur for the greater good. And as much as I do really enjoy the scenes where we have 5 crucified Jesuses sort of lined up in a dancing number or whatever, it's quite interesting to see that sort of imagery in that sculpture in Alex's room. Obviously, like from our discussions on Antichrist and the Witch, I might appeal a little bit to the sacrilegious from time to time, but I do think there is utility in some of these teachings, right? I think one big lesson, or at least one interesting narrative that we can take from this movie, is the importance of having sort of these masculine, quote unquote, stereotypical traits, but within certain boundaries. But also, I mean, if you layer on sort of this forgiveness perspective, that's almost the exact opposite, because you're sort of letting that happen. And I don't know if they really, I don't know, like maybe Kubrick didn't emphasize that nearly enough, because it makes it seem like all these softer, more submissive traits are worse than being more masculine and aggressive and just maybe a little bit like what we might consider evil. I don't know. Like they didn't emphasize that nearly enough. But then again, I think it's fair to say that Kubrick wasn't telling probably the same story that Burgess was.
Yeah, there are certainly differences, but I just think that the idea that Alex starts in a place of violence and horrible violence, just a totally shit person, and that there is a sort of redemptive arc to his character over the course of the film, and over the course of the book, seem to suggest that the film and the book are ending on similar points. Although I think you're right that you're right to draw a distinction between the film and the book. But the fact that there is a kind of redemptive arc for him is really it's challenging too, especially from a 21st century perspective where we're canceling people, where one sin made publicly can ruin your life. And that's
another thing that seems to come up. So I noticed this throughout history. People in power, when it comes to their ideas of how to deal with poor people, one of their things is to keep them working and don't let them get bored, or they'll do sins. That's been a constant mantra for freaking eons, I swear to God. All throughout history, you see these like rules and these ideas from the bourgeois types, saying that poor people need things to do, because if you don't give them something to do, they'll just act out. And there is that bit of an element of, is there boredom to what is going on with these kids? And do they have that hope for a future, or do they not want to live the life of their parents? And you see this also pop up in SLC Punk, where this idea of like, I don't want to grow up to be like you, dad. Probably is going to end up growing up to be like his dad. But this idea of like, no, I'm not going to just work 9 to 5 and hate my life and be miserable and bored and tired all day, and then you end up doing it anyway. And we're more and more realizing that this overworking, at least as far as American society is concerned, this overworking of people, and this idea that if we keep busy, it keeps us from doing horrible things. We've seen a couple of cases where that's not exactly what happens. Sometimes the overworking causes people to flip out and go after their place of business and after people they work for. So there definitely is this element of work for poor people. And is that what actually reforms Alex? Is this what Burgess thinks is going to reform him? Is just give him a job and he'll be fine. Like, is that his solution?
Perhaps, but that would put him certainly, like, if we take this quote at its face, then yes, that would be sort of a part of an idea of how to keep people occupied. But at the same time, I think that Burgess, if Burgess is aiming, and I think he is, for something higher and more spiritual and something that fits his sort of religious point of view, then there's larger questions there, and it's less about how you occupy your time and more about who you are as a person, and how your soul within Burgess's religious framework, the condition of your soul within Burgess's religious framework. At least that's how I view it. I did want to also bring up this really interesting discussion that Byron brought up once. I guess I'm just going to quote Byron all podcast long. Is that he differs with Burgess. I think he's off base. Forgiveness is more your own peace of mind. Hate and vengeance is a way to carry. And I think that that's an interesting, that's also a perception within Christian religious point of view, that vengeance and hate are the things that hurt you more than they hurt the other person. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Burgess's idea also makes a lot of sense to me. Like, it's a big religion, it's a big world, and where all of these ideas can kind of fit in it, at least.
Okay, I want to not to interject. I hope I'm not being rude, but I do want to say also, just to other societies and cultures' credit, that's also a Buddhist idea, and I think that probably predates Christianity a little bit. Just to be fair,
true.
Right?
True.
I think it was a Buddhist. It was probably Buddha who said that, like, revenge is like swallowing poison and expecting your enemy to die, or some shit like that, right? Like it's something like that, but the teaching is exactly the same, like that holding on to that anger does more damage to you than it does to the other person. Of course, this is a lesson that pervades through time, and I think it's also been proven true through current social psychology. And I think the perspective there is that the point of the criminal justice system ought to be around reform rather than punishment. Like retributive justice really, or at least in my perspective and my interpretation, doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So if you're putting someone in jail just to punish them, it seems to be a waste of tax dollars. And like, I mean, maybe the wronged party and the wronged family has some right to have that other person suffer the way that they've suffered, but again, like, I don't know, like maybe not. I mean, that for society as a whole, that doesn't seem to be really beneficial. And something I would say there too is that we have kind of like the death penalty, right? Like the ultimate punishment for people who commit murder in some states and so on and so forth. Like obviously we can make mistakes in the people in who we're throwing into the prison system and who we want to get revenge against. So not even just from that perspective, or the fact that we make mistakes about who we're supposed to be hurting because we think they hurt us, but as a society as a whole, it would make so much more sense to listen to the people and understand who they are and figure out why they're taking the actions that they're taking and try to make them better people, as opposed to just saying, well, you punched me, therefore I'm going to punch back, which is almost the direct quote from something that we saw in the movie. Like, why not be able to punch back? Anyway, yeah, so yes.
Yeah, restorative justice is what you're talking about, and those are there's quite a bit of scholarship in criminal justice studies about restorative justice, and a lot of it is very interesting and completely antithetical to what we're doing. And that kind of restorative criminal justice system would be, I think something that within the religious framework with which Burgess is working with, I think would be an interesting discussion. Unfortunately, I'm not as versed on that scholarship as I should be to be able to start talking about it with any intelligence right now.
I will say this, though, as much as I'm not about actually acting out vengeance and blah, 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 god damn, I love vengeance movies. They are my fucking favorite movies. I don't know why.
Dude, this is a debate that Jim and I are having currently. Not to derail, I know
No,
we want to have
please,
we want to have some
derail.
structure here, but him and I have had this discussion about John Wick. Whereas I fully appreciate that this man went on this huge killing spree because someone hurt his dog. Whereas Jim, I think it's unethical to have that kind of violence raised up on a pedestal in movies. So, not to
no, I think that's an awesome
stuff.
No, that's an awesome conversation. I love the conversation. This is one of my favorite topics. I think we should definitely delve into it at some point. There is a movie that I need to add to our list that is probably my favorite movie from last year. It was called Revenge. Yes, it's a revenge movie. It's called fucking Revenge.
Movie, all right.
And it's fantastic.
Movies I've ever seen.
It's so fucking good. If you guys have not seen Revenge, go see it. But I love vengeance movies. They are a treat for me. I don't know if in my personal life, it's my moral. But is that weird to like really enjoy media that has this element of vengeance when you're not actually for that, morally speaking? I mean, does this speak to the idea that Marilyn Manson was blamed for shootings and stuff? It's like, you know what? Sometimes I just like music. Sometimes I just like movies. Sometimes I just like books. It doesn't mean I want to go and just because I like Friday the 13th that I want to go to a campground and like slash up some teenagers. Maybe there's some element of entertainment to some of this shit we talk about. Maybe it doesn't have to all be seriousness. I don't know.
Not to mention, I do feel like one of the greatest movies. I absolutely love Old Boy, and as a more classical type of horror, that's inherently a revenge flick. And God, if that's not one of the best movies that I've ever seen in this genre.
That is in my top 5 of all time. It is the best. I do kind of like the vengeance stuff. Sorry, guys. And in a way, this is why I love the juxtaposition, right? Of, Alex and the panning out, and then the writer and then panning out, the vengeance that the right and he's getting off on it too. Like he's cranking the volume and he's like, oh, he's just so happy to play the music loudly. He knows exactly what's happening. He doesn't have a camera in there to see what's happening to Alex. He has no idea, but he knows. And he's just getting off on cranking the volume up louder and louder. And it's, I don't know. I kind of appeal to the writer in that film. And I don't think he deserved to be in jail. Let's like all band together and save the writer.
Save the writer. We'll make that the next T-shirt in our Deadly Analysis.
unless it's the writer in Lady in the Water. Let's not save that guy.
Oh no!
No, Adam. No,
you
Adam.
just brought that out for Noah. Oh boy. All right. Let's. So we're at. This is going to be one of our longer podcasts, and as well it should be, because Clockwork Orange is some deep film. I want to run through a few notes. This is just some technical merits of the film that feel free to just go ahead and unmute your mics and just interrupt me if you want to go off on any of these things. So I'm just going to sort of list these things and start and give brief notes about them before we go to our final thoughts. But feel free to, if you want to expand on anything that I have that I'm bringing up, please do. Let's talk about the language in this film. Anthony Burgess was a linguist. He essentially made up a language for this film. It's called NADSAT, N-A-D-S-A-T, and it is a sort of combination of slangish Russian and English with a little bit of weird English phrases, and the language of this film makes it incredibly interesting and incredibly charming, and sort of a film that kind of takes on a life of its own. I'm going to talk.
Can I give you a hint of how? Can I give you a hint on how I remember what it's called? It's so stupid. So if you sit on your nads, you start talking funny. So you nads that, and then you start talking a little
on
funny.
My nads, and then I said,
you started talking.
Oh, slushy, that's yeah, okay. The art direction of this film, the film's milieu is completely out of time. It's like this postmodern, futuristic, weird world. It's filled with sexual references, disembodiment of the female form, weird furniture choices, chairs that look like eggs. Go ahead, Shara.
But it predicted that us women would have purple and pink and blue and orange hair, and
as
that
you do, right?
And that our lighting might be slightly interesting in our living rooms, you know.
Ben, do you want to jump into the art direction before I keep going?
No, go ahead. I'm still thinking back to situations about NADSAT, right? Like I'm just looking over my life now.
You sit on your nads. The music, I think the classical music sort of lends the film kind of a jaunty irony. The classical music, it's not actually all Beethoven, some people might not know, but classical music sort of it adds to this mise en scène of an out of time world. Cinematography, you talked about this a little bit, Shara. The images are stark, and then Kubrick sort of pulling in and pushing out on these static scenes. And then the acting and the performances. Malcolm fucking McDowell. This is literally one of the most committed performances I have ever seen in my life. Have I ever seen an actor who is more committed to his character or more just completely free and uninhibited? That is what really good acting is, and that is what Malcolm McDowell brings to this role. So I just wanted to talk. We have to at least mention how this felt. We talked a lot about the themes, but we have to at least compliment some of the filmmaking. Anything also stand out to you guys?
I have to Malcolm McDowell out. So apparently, when this film was made, when Malcolm McDowell was supposed to be put in, Stanley Kubrick didn't want anybody else but him. That was his guy. They were considering Mick Jagger at one point, but he was like, that is my guy. And what's funny is Malcolm McDowell agreed to it thinking it was Stanley Kramer from the Mad World that was doing the film. And some of his friends, Malcolm McDowell's friends from other movies were like, oh, no, this is Stanley Kubrick here's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he was like, okay. And so he wasn't even like fully in or understanding what he was about to create. He didn't really know much about what he was going to create. But I think what really added to what he brought forth with this character, they stopped looking at scripts at a certain point and just carried around the book. They were really focused on the dialogue from the book. And so many people will talk about adaptions of books and like how movies have to be different and books are not going to be adapted perfectly to a movie, blah, blah, blah. And you hear this argument constantly. And so many people are like, the book is better than the movie, blah, 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 blah. But I think a huge part of what made this film work was that they accepted the book and its beauty and accepted its dialogue. And they kind of had to because that language. But I think fully embracing that book really added to the element to this film. And the fact that Malcolm McDowell was actually reading from the book in a lot of his performances, as opposed to reading from a script. I don't know. I feel like that might have added to this. And Jim, you and I were talking about this pre-show, but we've noticed that he hasn't really done that much of greatness since this character. And maybe there's something to be said about taking the adaptions from a book seriously and really fully accepting what the novel had in mind when putting forth a character you're about to become. So
well, he's made some wonky choices, and maybe there just hasn't been a film like there hasn't been a film like Clockwork Orange since A Clockwork Orange. Like nothing compares. Very few films compare to this film. So I don't know. I don't know what has sort of happened to him. And it's never for me to say, but this was definitely the Everest of his career, and he is so amazing in this movie. And I think,
I don't think
but it's really. Go ahead. Well, I'll make one quick point before I pass it on to you, Ben. Is I think that technical filmmakers like Kubrick, and Kubrick is more of a technical filmmaker than he is an actor's filmmaker. Technical filmmakers like Kubrick need actors like Malcolm McDowell who are able to imbue the character with more of a life than Kubrick is able to direct. I think that Kubrick often pushes toward extreme facial expressions. We even see that in this movie. He pushes toward creating the perfect shot rather than creating the perfect acting performance. And I think Clockwork Orange, Malcolm McDowell, and The Shining, Jack Nicholson, and I know somebody is going to disagree with me in the chat, Shelley Duvall in The Shining. Those are really good actors doing really good performances in a technically focused movie. So I think it's really important to make the movie as a whole good by having really good actors who are able to imbue these characters with life of their own. Go ahead, Ben, please.
Oh yeah. I was just gonna say, like in McDowell's defense, first of all, I think one question that we look at whenever we examine the quality of an actor is whether or not you believe their performance, right? Like that's the stereotypical thing. It's like, yes, I believed this performance, and I think that's absolutely true with McDowell here. It's like never was there a point in the movie where I was like, yeah, I don't really believe this person. You know what I mean? And that I think shines through, especially because of the weirdness in the dialogue and the specialized language and the surreal nature, I think, of this film. I totally believed what he was putting forward. Like, I think he fit perfectly. But again, like in the defense of his career, I think there are a lot of great actors that kind of like peak sort of early, and the landscape, I think, for the way that they get jobs is quite complex. And so, like, I don't want to hold it against him that, maybe nothing after A Clockwork Orange sort of stood out in terms of his performances as being even better than that. But yeah, I mean, it's quite complex, right? So I think he was fantastic in this role. He was totally believable, and I think that absolutely speaks to his quality, even if nothing after that had the same sort of acclaim that this particular film did.
You're right, Ben, and I should probably kind of backtrack some of my criticisms. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the things you're offered, and if he's not offered A Clockwork Orange, then what can he do except and we did get a couple recommendations in the chat that I didn't I'm not familiar with. But all right, folks, are we ready to go to final thoughts? Shayra, I'll let you close out. I'll start, and Ben, you can go after me. I love A Clockwork Orange. I think this is one of the best films. It's certainly one of the most interesting films that I've ever seen. I think it's one of the most important films of the 20th century with regard to some of the questions it's bringing up, with regard to violence, with regard to how we operate in a free society. I think the performances are amazing. I think the cinematography is amazing. I think in some cases it's just devilishly funny. I really love this movie. As I've said throughout the last 2 hours, I think that there are some criticisms to be had with the way it portrays women, whether or not this is a film that is, it's certainly skirting the line between satire and supporting the society that it's satirizing. It's difficult to tell in some cases, and the good satires, it's really not always, it's not difficult to tell. So it's a very mild criticism. Even then, I don't even believe what I'm just saying. So I love this movie. It's a 5 out of 5 for me, and a total recommend. Ben, what do you think of A Clockwork Orange?
How to follow that shit. I'm not gonna give it a 5 out of 5. I do think I think it's really good. It's gonna be a recommend for me.
Come
too.
on, Ben, join our 5 out of 5 club. Now your ratings are your own.
So at the beginning of this, I said I was middling. And I want to make sure that, like, while I think the arguments here were good and the discussion was fantastic, I don't want to let my vodka and cranberry talk for me when I give this rating. And so I'm going to try to like pace myself a little bit and think this through. I do think it was fantastic. Technically speaking, I really do like Kubrick as far as like his directorial influence on the film. And I really don't want to let the book influence my decision here too much either. But I do think there was so much more that they could have done with the story. And while there was sort of a similar tie-in, like there at the end, I think Jim, you made a really good point about that. There probably was a little bit more that could have been done if he wanted to tell that same story that Burgess told. It really doesn't seem redemptive to me. I think it does seem a little bit like dystopic. I really do see the major theme of this film being, there are manipulations in society, like evil things happen, and yes, they can be changed or whatever. But when you manipulate free will, it sort of like turns out for the worse. But there's really nothing you can do about it anyway because there's no free will to be had. I think the story is one in the film that sort of builds from act to act to become larger, which is fantastic. I love that. I love the satire. And there's just so much positive about this movie, but I see the potential and I'm like, I think it fell just a little bit short. And not only that, like, of course, like my higher ratings, I generally reserve for things that speak to me personally. That's a little bit subjective, but it is what it is. So at the end of the day, man, and I know I'm probably going to get hate for this, but if I'm being honest with myself, if I'm being really honest with myself, I kind of want to give this a 3.5 out of 5 because I don't think the emphasis was placed where it needed to be placed. In terms of giving it sort of like that larger narrative and playing to those deeper fears that we have. I don't necessarily know if this was intended to be a classic or like a true horror, but I do think there were some just flaws in general about how they could have not emphasized the glorification of Alex as a person. I think too much was done with the music and with the way that certain scenes were directed to make Alex seem like your buddy and your friend. And to glorify the negative aspects of his personality. And that was just too much at the forefront for me to give this like a larger rating from kind of like the narrative that I think it should have had. I don't know. Like, that's really my main complaint is that too much emphasis was put on the glorification of Alex's evil traits and making him seem too much of a source of empathy, right? Like he was too relatable because of his plight, because like he was turned into a victim, because the music played sort of like made the rape scenes and like the violent scenes uplifting, which I think just makes you want to relate to him a little bit more. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, not to like blather on about that, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to have to be a 0.5 out of 5 just because of some of those narrative shortcomings.
All right, allow me to squish that. So the awesomeness of this film, and I'm glad you actually brought this up just now because I get to say this now. And if you want to rebut it, please do. One of the amazing aspects of this film is it brought into the question of, can we trust the narrator? Can we trust what they're saying? This was a breaking point in film and storytelling, right? And breaking down those walls, when you start to feel sick to your stomach about your own morality because of your own views of Alex's way of telling this story, you start to question your own morality. That is the part of the brain warping awesomeness and the artistry of this film. So when you have him saying stuff like when he goes to prison and he's like, your humble narrator, when he describes himself and talks about how you're my only dear friends, my brothers left that actually care about me. And you want to say, I don't give a fuck about you, you raping, murdering asshole. And then I'm like, wait, I'm sticking around for the story though. So in a way I'm appealing to, you know, he's right. I am intrigued by his character. I am intrigued by his story. Fuck. It's calling you out. It's calling out your humanity. It's calling out the things that interest you. It's talking about the violence and the sexuality that you are drawn to. You know, when you start to see his view of the Bible, you're like, fuck, that's totally fucked, but goddamn, he has a different twist on it. Look at his perspective of art. He has an interesting interpretation of it all. and it's problematic, right? But in the same token, if you can tell a story properly with the right actor, with the right storyline, with the right words, you too could possibly, you know, take the side of a murderous rapist. And it's a struggle, right? Like, that's actually kind of the beauty of the film. It fucks with your head. And I'm sure there are plenty of other movies that kind of fucked with your head in that way, but goddamn, this one does a really good job of it. I don't know if you have a rebuttal to that, but goddamn, that's actually what drew me to this film, was that as a person who has actually struggled with these kinds of issues personally as a woman, I'm somehow on the side of this guy. What the fuck? And in a way, even sexually attracted to him. Not okay, but yeah, I'm sitting there going, yeah, he's kind of hot. Hey, Alex, I'll play with your snake any day. You know, that's not okay. But that's how it's set up and structured, and it fucks with your head. So it's kind of interesting. It's a beautiful piece of art because of that to me. If you don't have anything to say to that, geez, the direction, the writing, the sets are insanely inventive. The costumes, I mean, the fact that Malcolm was he did some kind of sport. I can't remember what it was now, but he was actually wearing his sporting gear when he came to the place to film stuff, and Stanley Kubrick saw that and was like, that would be great for your gang costume. Just make sure to wear your jockstrap over it. And then they did it and it worked out and it looked like a cod piece and it's fucking hilarious. The eyeball, bleeding eyeball cufflinks, like, goddamn, the costumes are so inventive. Even just the fake eyelashes, just beautiful. Goddamn, this movie is so beautiful, so inventive, so creative, and it makes you think. And every time I watch it, I see something new where I'm like, oh shit, fuck, I didn't think of that. That's great. And I'm probably going to look back at this show and wish I said more, but yeah, definite 5 out of 5 for me. This is my top. This is one of my top 5 of all time films. Old Boy's on there too. Just throwing that out there, Ben. But this is definitely one of my favorite movies, and probably always will be. I've loved it since I first saw it back in, I think I watched it finally in 2000. And I do consider it horror because it scared the shit out of me, especially when I found out that poor Malcolm actually had his eye cut from the device that was holding his eye, and he still has a permanent injury on his eyeball from this film. So like, that's dedication, and I appreciate all that it brought to us. I don't know. It's the greatest movie ever. Please watch it. Goddamn.
It's certainly up there. It's one of the most, I think it's one of the most important films, but all right. So thank you for joining us here at the Deadly Analysis Podcast. We were talking about Clockwork Orange, one of our favorite films, one of our highest rated films in the history of the podcast. Join us next week, where we will be talking about A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. This is a really interesting film. That's well, we'll get into it. If you enjoyed what you listened to and watched today, please feel free to give us a like, subscribe, and share us on all of the sites and hit us up on these social medias. We will be talking about Girl Walks Home at Night, Alone at Night next week, but we'll also have some other content for you guys coming during the week. Ben and I have our Deadly Analysis Shortcut series, which are a little more creative, and we also have 2-minute reviews that we are posting usually on Wednesdays. So we will continue to have those coming at you. Thanks again for joining us. We really enjoyed Clockwork Orange, and we hope you did enjoy. We hope you enjoyed listening to this as well. So have a good rest of the night. Thank you, everybody.